Mr. President, I come to the floor to address three specific issues. One of the first is a matter that I didn't know would actually be part of my responsibility as a senator. But over the years, my staff came to me and talked to me about political prisoners in far-flung nations around the world. Men and women literally in jail because they are exercising their right to speak, to be journalists, to assemble, to run for political office. And my staff said, they're forgotten. Nobody knows they're there. They languish in prisons for months and years and sometimes die there. Nobody even mentions their name. Would you consider coming to the floor of the Senate and saying something? Perhaps writing a letter to the embassy of the country where they're being held prisoner. I was skeptical as to whether or not that would even be worth the effort. But I've learned over the years it is. I've come to the Senate floor to raise the cases of political prisoners around the world, typically journalists, activists, who found themselves jailed for defending basic freedoms we take for granted. In some cases, with the help of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, we've seen the release of some of these prisoners. Others still languish. I bring their pictures to the floor because mentioning their names is important, but seeing them tells a story too. Raif Badawi and Walid Abu Khair in Saudi Arabia, and interim Venezuelan President Guaido's chief of staff, Roberto Marrero, continue to languish unjustly in prison. We continue to press for their release. I've always thought that trying to secure the release of political prisoners was worthwhile because it spoke to our values as Americans. I've had a chance to meet some of them after they were released. It is an amazing feeling after someone's spent years, literally years in prison, to have them come to my office here in the Capitol and break down in tears in gratitude. It reminds me that they shouldn't be forgotten, and neither should many others. Unfortunately, this president is too comfortable with these autocratic leaders who imprison people around the world. I wish he weren't. Which brings me to the Philippines, one of our key democratic allies in Asia. Over the Christmas break, I thought my friends were joking with me when they came to me and said, well, I guess you won't be going to the Philippines soon, and I didn't know what they were talking about. It turns out in my home state of Illinois, there are many Filipino Americans. It's one of our largest immigrant groups coming to our country. What an incredible population Filipino Americans are. As I've come to know them, strong, strong family values, strong religious values, hard-working folks. I mean, they open these little shops and sit in them for 16, 18 hours a day because that's the way the immigrating Filipino sets the stage for their son and daughter to have a better life. Well, over the holiday recess, the president of the Philippines, President Duterte, announced that he was banning Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, as well as myself and Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, from ever visiting the Philippines. I was kind of shocked to see that. I didn't expect it. What precipitated this reaction? He also incidentally threatened to restrict the travel of all Americans to the Philippines. Well, for some time, several of us, including Senator Leahy and Senator Markey, have been advocating for the release of Filipino Senator Leila de Lima. Senator de Lima was the former head of the National Human Rights Commission of the Philippines and an internationally recognized human rights champion, critical of President Duterte's extrajudicial killings. What did that lead to? Her arrest and her being sentenced and imprisoned for 3 years in jail for speaking out against the current president of the Philippines. Here's a photo of her being taken to court after she was arrested a little over 3 years ago. Who's behind her release? Not just Senator Leahy, Durbin, and Markey, and many of our colleagues, but also Amnesty International, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and the Ruhl Wallenberg Center. Let me read an excerpt from a letter she sent me. As you can imagine, I may be the one currently in detention, but I'm not the only victim suffering in this situation. So are the victims of extrajudicial killings and their families. So are all defenders of human rights. And ultimately, so are all of us all over the world who defend democracy and the rule of law. Senator Markey has a resolution calling for Senator Lima's release and an end to the harassment of Filipino journalist Maria Ressa that I'm proud to co-sponsor and I hope will pass the Senate soon. Last year, Senator Leahy was just on the floor, joined me in an amendment to the State and Foreign Operations Bill denying U.S. visas from those involved in Senator de Lima's politically motivated incarceration. It was our little measure in that appropriation bill that led President Duterte to ban us from ever traveling to the Philippines. There is an easy and honorable way forward. The Duterte regime should stop threatening the travel of Filipino Americans and so many others who travel between our nations, and instead assure a quick and credible trial for Senator de Lima, or simply do the right thing and release her. In the end, her freedom and the end of government harassment of journalists like Maria Ressa will be important tests of whether cherished democratic norms we share with our longstanding Filipino allies will be respected by President Duterte. Mr. President, I ask consent to speak on a separate topic that be placed as a separate part of the record.
Without objection.